Just Mercy, Epilogue. Walter died on September 11th, 2013. He remained kind and charming until the very end, despite his increasing confusion from the advanced dementia. He lived with his sister, Katie, but in the last 2 years of his life, he couldn't enjoy the outdoors or get around much without help. One morning, he fell and fractured his hip. The hospital sent him home with a little hope of recovery. He lost a lot of weight and became less and less responsive to visitors. He passed away quietly in the night a short time later. We held Walter's funeral at Limestone Falk AME Zion Church near Monroeville on a rainy Saturday morning. It was the same pulpit where, more than 20 years earlier, I had spoken to the congregation about casting and catching stones. It felt strange to be back. People packed the church, and dozens more stood outside. I looked at the mostly poor, rural black people huddled together for this sad occasion, made all the more tragic by the unjustified pain and torment that had preceded it. I often had this feeling when I worked on Walter's case that if the anguish of all the oppressed people in Monroe County could be gathered in one place, it could power something extraordinary, capable of igniting some righteous disruption or transformational redemption. The family had a large TV monitor near the casket that flashed dozens of pictures of Walter before the service. Almost all the photos were taken on the day he was released from prison. Walter and I stood next to each other in several of the photos, and I was struck by how happy we both seemed. I sat in the church and watched the pictures with some disbelief about the time that had passed. When Walter was on death row, he once told me how ill he'd had become during the execution of one of the men on his tier. When they turned on the electric chair, you could smell the flesh burning. We were all banging on the bars to protest, to make ourselves feel better, but really it just made me sick. The harder I banged, the more I couldn't stand any of it. He asked me once, "Do you ever think about dying?" I never did before, but now I think about it all the time. He looked troubled. This, right here, is a whole nother kind of situation. Guys on the road talk about what they're going to do before their executions, how they're going to act. I used to think it was crazy to talk like that, but I guess I'm starting to do it too. "Well, you should think about living, man. What you're going to do when you get out of here," I replied. "Oh, I do that too. I do that a lot. It's just hard when you see people going down that hall to be killed. Dying on some court schedule or some prison schedule ain't right. People are supposed to die on God's schedule." The funeral service began. A choir sang. The preacher gave a rousing sermon, honored Walter, and lamented that he had been pulled away from his family in the prime of his life by lies and bigotry. I took the pulpit next, taking a deep breath before speaking. I told the congregation that Walter had become like a brother to me, that he was brave to trust his life to someone who was as young as I was then. I explained that we all owed Walter something. He had been threatened and terrorized, wrongly accused and wrongly condemned, but he never gave up. He survived the humiliation of his trial and the charges against him. He survived a guilty verdict, death row, and the wrongful condemnation of an entire state. While he did not survive without injury or trauma, he came out with his dignity. He had stood strong in the face of injustice, a strength that just might have made the rest of us a little safer, a little more protected from the abuse of power that had almost killed him. I suggested to his friends and family that Walter's strength, resistance, and perseverance were a triumph worth celebrating, an accomplishment to be remembered. I felt the need to explain to people that Walter had taught me what Walter had taught me. Walter made me understand why we have to reform a system of criminal justice that continues to treat people better if they are rich and guilty than if they are poor and innocent. A system that favors wealth and status while denying the poor the legal help they need must be changed. Walter's case taught me that fear and anger are a threat to justice. They can infect a community, a state, or a nation, and make us blind, irrational, and dangerous. I reflected on how mass imprisonment has littered the national landscape with monuments of reckless and excessive punishments, and ravaged communities with our hopeless willingness to condemn and discard the most vulnerable among us. I told the congregation that Walter's case had taught me that the death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for crimes they commit. The real question of capital punishment in this country is, do we deserve to kill? Finally, and most importantly, I told those gathered in the church that Walter had taught me that mercy is just when it is rooted in hopefulness and freely given. Mercy is most empowering, liberating, and transformative when it is directed at the undeserving. The people who haven't earned it, who haven't even sought it, are the most meaningful recipients of our compassion. Walter genuinely forgave the people who unfairly accused him, the people who convicted him, and the people who judged him unworthy of mercy. And in the end, it was just mercy toward others that allowed him to recover a life worth celebrating. A life that rediscovered the love and freedom that all humans desire. A life that overcame death and condemnation until it was time to die on God's schedule. After the service, I didn't stay long. I walked outside and looked down the road and thought about the fact that no one was ever prosecuted for Rhonda Morrison's murder after Walter's release. I thought about the anguish that must still create for her parents. There were lots of people who came up to me who needed legal help for all sorts of things. I wrote my number down for each person and encouraged them to call my office. I made the journey home less sad to hope that maybe we could help. Since the Supreme Court's 2012 ruling banning mandatory life imprisonment without parole for children, nearly 2,000 people condemned to die in prison when they were children have been resentenced and now have a chance to go home. Nearly 200 people previously sentenced to death in prison as juveniles have been released. More than a dozen of our Louisiana clients who were sentenced as juveniles to die in prison are now at home. Ian Manuel has been released. Antonio Nunez has a chance to be released. And finally, Joe Sullivan has been released. Trina Garnett's sentence has been reduced and she is now eligible to be released. Her spirit remains strong. I continue to meet stonecatchers along the way who inspire me and make me believe that we can do better than we've done for the accused, convicted, and condemned among us, as well as those who are victimized by crime and violence, and that all of us can do better for one another. The work continues. Acknowledgements. I want to thank the hundreds of accused, convicted, and imprisoned men, women, and children with whom I have worked and who have taught me so much about hope, justice, and mercy. I'm especially appreciative of and humbled by the people who appear in this book, victims and survivors of violence, criminal justice professors, and those who have been condemned to unimaginably painful spaces and yet show tremendous courage and grace. All the names of people who appear in these pages are real, with the exception of just a few whose privacy and security needed to be protected. I want to thank Beverly Horowitz, Rebecca Gudelis, and the wonderful team at Delacorte Press and Random House Children's Books for their incredible assistance and guidance on this project. I am so honored to share my work with young people whose understanding of these issues is crucial if we are to create a more just society. I want to thank Erin Ural and Brandy Suskin at EJI for editing and feedback. I am also grateful to my agent, Doug Abrams, for his guidance. None of my work is possible without the extraordinary women and men who work at the Equal Justice Initiative. I'm proud to work with such talented and gifted people who strive each day to create a better world. Thank you, EJI. And that is the end of Just Mercy.